start with a blessing song. Thank you. Thank you so much to Robert Bass and the Eagle Point Singers at the drum for this blessing song. I'm Kelly McDonough. I'm Anishinaabe and Irish descent. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. I'm also a member of the advisory council of the program in Native American and Indigenous Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm honored that you've chosen to be with us here today for what promises to be an invigorating event. We have a very full and exciting schedule, which was made possible with support from many, many co-sponsors. On behalf of the program in Native American and Indigenous Studies, we'd like to express our gratitude to the College of Liberal Arts, the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement, the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice School of Law, the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, the Department of English. And this is a long list, and it's lovely because these are all the people that have supported us and brought us here together. The Center for Women and Gender Studies, the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, College of Education, the Department of Linguistics, the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, the Department of History, the Humanities Institute, the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy, the College of Education, the Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, the Program in Comparative Literature, the Social Justice Institute, and the Department of American Studies. We have very good friends here on campus. Thank you to all of our sponsors. Today we will hear from two very distinguished guest speakers. After their respective presentations, there will be time for dialogue and questions. Following this, we invite you to a feast, a community gratitude dinner, down the hall and to the right in the ballroom. Right? Before we continue, please check your cell phone to see that it's on, at least vibrate. I'll do the same when I sit down. We will begin with opening remarks from esteemed members of the university. Please join me in welcoming Dean Esther Raisin, Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Student Affairs in the College of Liberal Arts. Dean Raisin.
Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the University of Texas at Austin, and I bring with me the greetings of Dean Deal and Dean Flores, who could not be with us today. And speaking of people who could not be with us today, all three of us wish to convey a greeting to David Chokawanka, who could not be with us today, but for different reasons. I want to thank Louise for inviting me today, and more so for his excellent work as Director of Native American and Indigenous Studies. Yes. This event, and my deepest appreciation and thanks to our distinguished Indigenous leaders in the Americas for coming to our campus for this important dialogue marking the 10-year anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. What these leaders represent are the diverse experiences of Indigenous people across 2 continents, people with distinct languages, histories, and customs. But they're also leaders who are united in the active, relentless pursuit of the economic, social, and political advancement of Indigenous peoples around the world. Not only does their work benefit Indigenous people, it also enriches the human experience for us all. Same is true for the university community. For too long, yes, too long, our institutions of higher learning excluded or marginalized underrepresented populations. Not only were some voices left out of academic life, but our academic experience itself was greatly diminished by their absence. This is changing. A Native American and Indigenous Studies program with its focus on scholarship and intellectual exchange that contributes to the advancement of Indigenous peoples' social justice also enhances the educational environment of the university as a whole. It also advances the goal of the College of Liberal Arts to teach students to think creatively and critically, to analyze situations from multiple perspectives, and to appreciate diverse human experiences in ways that allow them to enter with great empathy into the lives of others and welcome the entry of others into their own lives. Together, we learn that our lives have greater meaning not only when we respect the rights of others, but also when we celebrate the rich diversity of our shared human experience. In my own lifetime, I have not felt the need for affirming our commitment to embracing diversity as I do today.
My Auntie LaDonna or Mama LaDonna, as she is affectionately known by countless folks from around the world, from Albuquerque to Aotearoa, from New Mexico to New Zealand. Auntie LaDonna is one of the most loving and generous human beings that I know. She exemplifies what it means to be a Comanche today, to be both an individual and communal at the same time. To be, as she reminded me just last night again at dinner, to be a strong and responsible individual with personal koha, or medicine, our strengths, our talents, that you can then share and contribute to your community. Grounded in strong Comanche values and obligations, as I said earlier, the reciprocity, redistribution, relationship, and responsibility, the 4 R's. She speaks tirelessly to historical and contemporary Native experiences and critical issues and realities in a time when many choose to ignore or erroneously think that our philosophies, our old ways, our epistemologies have somehow vanished. They never have, never will. As I said in my introduction of her when she visited back in 2010 at Southwestern University up the road in Georgetown, that her love for all Comanches and for all of life inspire and bring about feelings of pride for many of us to be Comanche, to recognize and to embrace where we come from, to remember who our people were, and as a friendly reminder to all of us that we are still here, to know who we are today and to work together now and in the future. And to do that for the future generations. LaDonna Harris constructs spaces and communicates ideas in gracious, inclusive, and giving ways, to where her knowledge becomes more than just insights into Comanche worldviews and ways of sensing our surroundings. Rather, her knowledge becomes transformative, that what she speaks is a Comanche worldview. And that worldview constantly comes across during each of our visits over the years. I'll give you one example. I remember from our phone visit across the airways of La Comancheria from Austin to Albuquerque on June 7, 2013, 2 weeks to the day before our Comanche Nation hosted in Lawton, Oklahoma, an advanced screening of Disney's Western The Lone Ranger, controversially starring Johnny Depp as a Comanche Tonto. LaDonna had been reading about the casting and critics' suspicion and rejection of Depp's longtime claims to Indigenous ancestry. As someone whose own relatives are captives, as she tells me, LaDonna's great-grandfather immigrated from Spain to Mexico, where he was captured by her tribal sister, Iola Hayden's great-grandfather back in the 19th century. Harris empathized with Depp's search for an Indigenous identity off-screen and appreciated his determination to showcase to the world a Comanche character on-screen. So she decided, as she audibly grinned into the phone that day to me, she decided to be like, quote, real Comanche women. We're going to go capture Johnny Depp. And she did. The capture, the adoption, soon became official in a traditional Comanche ceremony in her home. Johnny Depp doesn't turn her down. You don't do that. And now Johnny calls her Mom. Yeah. And it's that kind of welcome and that embrace that so many of us, whether we've known her for years or we've just met, that so many of us recognize and feel. And it's been my honor this week to help welcome in that tradition, to help welcome LaDonna Harris, my auntie, to this part of La Comancheria and to the University of Texas at Austin.
Whatever makes everybody welcome.
Well, as Dustin said, it's good to be in Comanche country. We claimed this part, and then to the meeting with the students this morning, I'm eating my way to the university, starting this morning with breakfast, and we had such a wonderful meeting. Got new earrings from my sister who gave her tribe gave Comanches a peyote, and this is peyote, and this is my earrings. My grandfather was a peyote man. My grandmother was the second Comanche to be converted to Christianity. So you can imagine what a an atmosphere that they taught me through their relationship that everybody has the truth, and it's their truth. And as my grandfather told me, said that you don't take anyone's religion away from them because you will hurt them, but you'll hurt yourself. And I think that their relationship, they worked with such a great, we were talking to my sister, and we were saying, the world has become so complicated in our countries. If you listen to the television today, I just start crying. But being said to her last words were that our country's the separatist feeling. I'm sorry. It's been a big day. Thank you. That's what I need. I'll get over this, you guys. Which is so Well, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and Dustin's description of growing up in Cotton County, Oklahoma. I was born in 1931 on my grandmother's allotment. We had allotments, we didn't have reservations in Oklahoma. And my father went off, when I was still a baby, he was an Irishman, and he went off to California to work. Is what he got there. A lot of Oklahomans did to find jobs in 31. And my mother went to work at the Indian Hospital because at that time in federal government hospitals, Indian hospitals, they had to live on campus, so she had to live in the dorm to provide services for patients. And so I was raised by my grandparents, Wicca and John Taggart. It was the best thing that I guess ever happened to me. It was such a rich experience growing up in Newark. I would walk down the street with my grandmother, and she wore traditional Comanche clothes and shawl and all, and walk down to go marketing in Temple, Oklahoma, buy some dry goods, sell our eggs, and go get. We could go to the movie for 10 cents, I think it was at that time. But grandmother would. I was always amazed at her that we'd go into the department stores and they would say, "Oh, Miss Taggart, we have some new dry goods to show you." And I thought, "Oh, she's just so neat. She knows everybody." So when we would meet another Comanche woman on the street, they would embrace, and then I would love to be with her because they would always hug me and pet me and call me by a kinship term, either my little daughter or my granddaughter or my little niece. And I would ask grandmother afterward, I said, "How are we kin to those people?" And she said, "Oh," she'd say, and she would go on for 30 minutes. And it wouldn't be that we were blood kin, but our families had done something for them, or they had done something for us. So I felt that I belonged to everybody. And that's what really was my strength, that I felt I belonged to everyone. And it put me through any kind of discomfort I found about discrimination growing up. And felt so strong and wonderful with all my relatives and Cash. We had relatives in Cash as well as in Temple, because many of our relatives stayed around the Wichita Mountains because we had some sacred places around there. But my captive great-grandfather that Dustin referred to, there was an outbreak of smallpox because they'd opened up some land that took away from the Comanches to give to people from outside who were coming. So the outbreak of smallpox, but we were delegated 160 acres. So my captive grandfather, who had become a Comanche war chief by that time, went down, because everybody was grieving over their loss, went down and got this land that was close to the creek and close to water. And so my grandfather became a very successful farmer for the transition, who was a man who literally went from arrows to atoms in his lifetime. And he had such a interesting view of the world. And then of course, he wore long braids, and he would put yarn in them to make them look dark or black, with black yarn in them. And he also had no facial hair, and he would pluck his eyebrows so that his face was clear. And he would, and that was one of my chores, he would ask me, Comanche, please come and there was something he couldn't reach, and so I had down there going, helping him with this. But it was that kind of atmosphere that I grew up in that felt completed, and then I went to school. And I found out several things that I wasn't, but I didn't come from an ordinary, the American family. I know that some of you had Dick and Jane in first grade. Dick and Jane, the book Dick and Jane. Well, it was the American, our teacher said, that it was the true American family was Dick and Jane. And Dick, of course, was the father, and Jane was the mother, and they had a daughter and a son, and a dog and a cat. And that was what Americans should look like. And I said, that's not me. All I say is his first grader. So that's not me. And something must be wrong with me. That was the first thing that came into my mind. And so I worried about it, and I couldn't figure out, I didn't even know how to talk to people about it. So there was no one I'd talk to, and I finally decided, well, Mother was really quite heroic to go off and leave her family and go to live in a town and live in a dormitory. And my grandparents both went, but they didn't last in Indian government's public schools, Indian boarding schools. Grandfather ran off, and he first got punished for some infraction, and he got locked in the basement of the Indians school at Riverside. And so the next morning he got up, and they were having a picnic, and he and a friend took some of the food at the picnic and ran off and went 200 miles back home. And so many children did that and didn't make it back home sometimes. But he didn't learn to read and write, and but he was a very intelligent man, and he didn't speak English very well. But as I told some of, I think the young people I had breakfast with, that he could curse in English very well. And that growing up in 31, that one of the things I thought that President Hoover's name was that goddamn. Because that's what Papa would call him every time he had some sort of incident, his tractor broke down or something, he would say, that goddamn Hoover. So I always thought that was his first name. He was a great Roosevelt man. And they would be the first, interesting that they would be the first people, though he couldn't read or write, but he knew how to mark the ballot. And he would go and vote. We'd go vote, all the kids would go vote with him. I had an aunt the same age as I. And and I had sisters, well, she was older than me. And we all lived there and just had the house was always filled with cousins and relatives. And then we'd go to Cache to see our grandmother, who had 7 different husbands. And so she had different groups of children. And they were all kin to me, and they were all this close kin. And so it was always so fun to go see her. She was our matriarch of our family. And she had a cane, she wore a cane, and I was visioning myself, and I got old, and here I am talking. And instead of sitting there and punching the kids and saying, go get me some water, she'd say to Comanche, go get me some water. And we would go and feel really complimented that she had chosen us to go get her water. But I was just trying to show you the atmosphere that I grew up in. And then starting to school, and I might say that I failed the first grade, but I also was dyslexic. Nobody knew what dyslexic was, but I couldn't spell. And I managed to pass the second time was that I learned that we had flashcards. Remember, anybody my age had flashcards. And I would look at the cards and not remember the letter on the cards, but I remember some little dirt or something on the cards, and what it represented meant more to me than the letter. So someday I satisfied the teacher by being able to tell her what letter was on the card. So then I found it very difficult, school very difficult. Because I didn't know, I would say, ask my aunt, said, how do you spell so-and-so? And she said, look it up in the dictionary. And I said, if I could look it up in the dictionary, I'd learn, I know how to spell it. So nobody knew what was wrong with me because nobody understood dyslexia until many years later, through my son, who, poor thing, inherited it. But but going through school with that handicap, I guess, to call it, for that lack of a better word, was that it made me more intense listening to my teacher, so that by the end of the class, during the class, I could tell her that I learned what she was teaching, and enough to satisfy her so that I got through school. And I did it all through all through high school and everything. So that was one of the things I overcame, but it also gave me a good, it became my medicine, so to speak, is that I could study people and figure out how to relate to them and how to share with them that would make them feel better so that they would accept me for one thing. And I think a lot of people of color have do that so that it's kind of a protection to not to be hurt. But to study people and figure them out before that they thought it's a stoic Indian. Remember the stoic Indian girl? Well, I was one of those. And I waited, but then I became a part of the school activity. I married my high school, who was the president of the student body, and went on and ran for Turkey Queen of Cotton County. Well, don't lie. That was very important. I was the first Indian that ever ran for any kind of queen. In Turkey Queen, we were in Cotton County. We said we were the turkey capital of the world. And so being Turkey Queen meant that I had great position. Well, became a good girlfriend of mine and her boyfriend, and our crazy principal got them to count the ballots. So our boyfriends counted the ballots of the contest. Well, I won the first round, and then Fred said, on my campaign, he said, well, let's have another vote then. She's still close. Well, she won the next time. And so she was made Turkey Queen, and I was only runner-up. And somebody said, aren't you glad you weren't Turkey Queen? You were only runner-up. I said, who would want to be Turkey Queen? But it was a big thing. We drove the truck for the Turkey Queen. Because down in the city, we would throw off turkeys, off the building because everybody brought turkeys and we'd celebrate our event. I'll just tell you a little bit about growing up. And watching, and I guess my first activity, I think, was interesting. After work to get credit through college and through law school, we both worked, and then we had Catherine, our oldest daughter, and then he graduated and we went to Lawton. And in Lawton, I had a large African American community in Lawton, and that was very segregated. We had the railroad track, and African American community of there. We didn't have that. Indians didn't have that kind of discrimination, except they was there. One of the things, too, that I would say, going back to the first grade teacher, I didn't blame the teacher. I learned not to blame the teacher because we don't teach American history. We teach Europeans coming to the Americas, so that nobody knows about us. That's what Indian 101 is all about. And because they don't know about us, we're either mysterious or we're below the core drunk Indian. We had stereotypes that we had to overcome. And it was very difficult to go through all of that. We dropped out of school. We had 75% dropout in parts of Oklahoma. And so, but let me tell you that my first civic organization was Integrated Lawton, Oklahoma. And I got very much involved, and we had a wonderful time integrating Lawton. We had Fort Sill right next door, and we integrated all the restaurants. Our group of women started it, of course, and then the men finally joined us after we were succeeding. and we were succeeding. And the Bears had a special committee, but we were doing it kind of in friendship. We became friendship, and we'd have one of the meetings at my house, and then we'd go with the Owenses on the other side of the track. So we got to be personal friends, and they were so loyal. And I am an honorary Delta, which is part of the Black sorority that they honor me by. Because of that work, they all knew about that. And it was very intense. And then one woman had a restaurant, and she wouldn't agree to have African Americans in the restaurant. And so we, by that time, had gotten to know the head of the Fort Sill commanding officer. So he put that restaurant off limits. And her whole constituent, her whole people who used the restaurant were soldiers. So no soldier could go to that restaurant. And she quickly changed them up. So we integrated. And that was my first, I just want to share that first experience. And then I thought, why am I doing all this? And I should be working in my own community. Because our kids were dropping out of school, and some of them were, it was a pretty bad situation. And the University of Oklahoma had a Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies. And they'd asked Fred to be a member of that. And he said, why don't you ask LaDonna, she'd contribute, and then she could tell me what to do. So they asked me to, and I went up, and I had not become the talkative person that you know now. And I wasn't very articulate. And so they said they were taking care of African American prejudice and labor management. So I said, put up my hand and said, what about Native Americans? And he said, oh, the Bureau of Indian Affairs takes care of Indians. We don't have to do that. And I said, no, they don't. And I got so passionate about responding to them that I cried. And so they embarrassed them, and they said, okay, we better do something about Native Americans. I've done that. I either get Crazy Indian Woman Act or burst into tears, and you don't want to see the one of the slides demonstrated some of it. But here's the intellectual community of Oklahoma, and they didn't know anything about Indians. And where Oklahoma was supposed to be all Indian territory, and they were going to force all the Indians to Oklahoma, and of course they changed their mind because they struck oil and they didn't make it in all Indian Indian state. And you could draw the line down the center, and the tribes that were forced into Oklahoma on the eastern side of the state, and the nomadic tribes were on the western side of the state. And culturally, we were so different because they were woodlands people and we were nomadic people. And so we never dealt with them until we organized Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity and worked with them. So we had the first statewide Indian organization. And we started doing all kinds of things. And it was really fun to do because it was mostly just telling people, educating people. And then Fred was elected to the U.S. Senate. Oh, let me tell you too, he was elected to the state Senate, and he would want me to go up and watch whatever legislation he was involved in. And then he would, he shared the room, sitting room with the President Pro Tem of the Senate, so he was mentoring Fred. So I would go up there, and we had, anyway, so I did as hostess to all these senators, and I was the only wife there. I turned out to be the only woman in many of these stories. And in the same way with the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies. And they would say, oh, well, let's, because I would act as hostess for them and take care of them and be like it was at my home. And so they would say, well, let's go to dinners. And this old senator from Eastern Oklahoma would say, well, let's take Freddie and the Indian and go to dinner. But he was being affectionate. That was his way to be affectionate. But it was there. I mean, it was there. I wasn't offended because I knew him. And I knew that he was trying to be inclusive. But but that was the way he dressed me. So I was telling these stories just to show you what it was like growing up. And then on the west side of the state, they had signs that no Indians or dogs allowed in the restaurant. And so that was the atmosphere, and that was why it was important to organize Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, because we had 39 different tribes in that one state. And as I said, they had, some of the tribes were woodlands people, and the rest of us were plains people. And so that we didn't work together until we organized that statewide organization. And then we went to Washington, and my big kids, Bud Wilkinson, as Texans, old Texans know who Bud Wilkinson is, and he was the coach of the OU football team. And he was the great white hope that came back to Oklahoma and got us on national news and had the great big football team. And he ran against him, and no one gave us a chance that we would win. But so a lot of the people told Fred in his campaign, there's too much LaDonna, and said we always had to put this Indian stuff in our literature. And he said, yes, it's very important, and yes, LaDonna is very important. And again, I was always the only woman for such a long time. And anyway, going to Washington, and I thought, well, being so active in Oklahoma, that how would I fit in the Senate women's group? The Senate women met every Thursday, and they bandages, they cloth about this big, and they would take it and fold it, and it would be a gauze, and they would send it to the hospital for the veterans, veteran hospital. And so I was just squirming in my seat, but I did it because that's what Senate wives did, and I was learning how to do that. So all of a sudden I met Sarge Schreiber. He was Lyndon Johnson became president, and he did the war on poverty, and everybody said, well, it didn't work. Well, it worked with Indians because they had these programs, and that went directly, and all the leadership of that is my age group, came out of that war on poverty program. They became organizers, community organizers, and it was what we used to organize Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity. And so that little bit of help that we got through that program changed the atmosphere of the country, and I had contacts with all of these people from Peter McDonald from Navajo, I can just name Philip Martin, all of these people who came out of that program, had worked in that program and became community organizers, and we became a national network. So that's what we did. And then going to Washington was so disappointing because nobody knew about it. Nobody, and they'd just be blank, except, of course, Lyndon Johnson always said that the Indians came around by his ranch. And I said, no, that was Comanches. I bet you didn't have any horses left. Because he teased me like that. So, but the thing I wanted to show you, I guess it was to really share with you, was that Washington was a great adventure for me because nobody understood who I was or what I did. And so I don't know why I took it on myself to educate them. But grandmother, when I came home one time, I was crying to grandmother before we went to Washington, and I was a girl, and she said, don't feel bad. She said, have pity for them because they don't know you and they don't understand you, and they bless your hearts because they don't try to learn about you, and they're neglected. They're pitiful people because they don't know about Indians. So that's what she said to make me feel good. And so I kind of had to take that, and she said, don't let them make you mad, because if you get mad, you won't have good judgment. And so rather than becoming radical, anti, I became this person that could deal with people that didn't understand me. And I took on the members of Congress, senators, the cabinet. I went to every cabinet member. Well, Lyndon Johnson did say this too. He said he appointed the first Indian head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was all around by 1980. And he said, I'm going to give you go over to the Smithsonian and get a tomahawk and knock all the dead wood of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so he just endeared himself to me, and I thought that was great. And he said, the Indians are citizens of the country, and they're entitled to all of the services that the government renders, when he said that, it broke me out of the Bureau of Indian, depended on the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so I started educating the secretaries of the, well, not I, but we should say, educating all the cabinet members and convincing them to have an Indian vest because they didn't know how to deal with Indians. So it turned out to be magic. And so we started Americans for Indian Opportunity, but quickly to say what we did in Americans for Indian Opportunity, we organized tribes who had oil and gas, and we organized the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. They threw off the shackles of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and became control of their own resources, and they were being cheated at the top, they were being cheated by the government, and they organized and they were able to take over their own resources. I tell you that because it's getting back to international. What I've learned doing that, and you look at what's happening particularly in South America, our friends in South America, who, because now the richest deposit of minerals and all kinds of resources are now on indigenous land. And so that they're going through this phase that we went through in the 60s and trying to figure out how to, both they need the resources, they need the income from any kind of resources, but how do they manage it in a way that is useful to them and not destroy their environment and all of those things. So one of the things we did, we had what we call the Ambassadors Program, and you heard the 4 R's that we had. Relationships is the most important. Second is responsibility to those relationships, because we as Native Americans, we're related to everybody and all things, and even to the stars. We knew that we had DNA from the stars before the scientists said we did. And so that we're related to all things, relationship was important, and how to, what did I say? Help me with my relationships. Yes, responsibility to the relationship, and then after that comes redistribution and redistribution and reciprocal. That, if you admire my ring, I'm supposed to take it off and give it to you if I'm a really good Comanche. I've been in white society. But that truly is that if you marry, and we have a painting of Scott Momaday's father that Fred admired at one of my relatives, and they gave it to him. He was so embarrassed. But that's what we should do, because we should be able to give whatever we wanted to make this friendship. That's how I got my hearing. And also that in doing so, that you don't become a hoarder. That these things don't take care. They're not important to you. That you're something more than these things, and so that you don't bog down and get wrapped up in that being dictated to your life. And so that was an important message in this. And so the ambassador program thing, as somebody said, they now call me Mama. LaDonna had 250 LaDonna, and then the same amount in New Zealand. And so we went to, we took these ambassadors to one of the trips. First we talked about who are you? What is your culture? Talk about, some of them had real sad stories, but nobody, everything that we were experiencing was taking our culture away. We couldn't identify with it. So the major thing that we worked with first was, who are you? You had to tell us about your family and about yourself and your tribe, and who are you in relationship to those. So and so in in that program, then we took them to an international, took them to Washington to study the culture of Washington. But the most important part that I really want is important to this international aspect of it is that we took them to Latin America to see other indigenous people. And then we just immediately you find a kinship and immediately find this relationship that you can communicate so well. And we took, sister and I took a picture of a vacant seat between us because you don't have the privilege of knowing this man from Bolivia like I do. We went to Bolivia many times and we got to know the president. We gave him gifts and he was so impressed with us that he invited us to the equivalent to the White House in Bolivia. And then when he, before that, when he was inaugurated, that we were invited, his second term, when he was inaugurated, we were invited to his inauguration. And we were treated like ambassadors from other countries because we were indigenous. And the U.S. calls him a socialist or communist, and that's why he's not here tonight. Because, I mean, not the president, but his secretary of indigenous peoples. That was what his title was when I got to know him through the president. And he was assigned to me and brought all of the indigenous peoples, or representatives of the indigenous peoples, to visit with us, the Americans, and share what our program was. And we shared it with them. And they said they liked it. And I said, well, we had one of the ambassador from Bolivia and asked him to tell what the experience was to work with us. And he told them, and they said, oh, we all want to be ambassadors. And so we exchanged values and we exchanged lifestyles, and it was so enriching. And I just wished our government had been so short-sighted, because they see that they look at the government of Bolivia because he's an indigenous person, he's not a Spaniard, and that they call him either socialists or communists, whichever. And so that's why they determined that you can't have that guest here at the university, because the United States government doesn't know how to work with Bolivia. And they can't understand, they don't know about us and their own indigenous people, so how are they going to understand an indigenous president? And so I wanted to share that with you, because when in his inauguration, he's an indigenous person from the Andes, Neuroticus, and when you come up on the scene for his inauguration, the medicine men are cleansing for the ceremony. And he comes down off this old, that's older than the people of, I'm forgetting the title of the tribe. But it's an old ancient place, and so he had the ceremony there. And then he treated the tribes from the United States as they were ambassadors, and he had us come, and I had a gift for him. And I didn't know if he would remember. He said, oh, Comanche, he said, when he was up there with his clothes. But I tell you, then we've gone to Peru and met with the government and the indigenous leadership there, our little Peruvian ambassador, got that all worked out. And because they're loyal, China and the United States are just bombarding all the indigenous people about to develop their oil. And I tell you, so that they're going through what we've gone through, and so that we can really play a role with each other. I'm sorry, I'm taking too long, and my sister, where she did she leave us? And our Canadian relative to really, she's very much involved with the organizations there, where we have just been used as to come and talk to them about what's happening. But it's an exciting time in South America. There's so much beauty And because Morales is indigenous, that it's changing all of the indigenous, the Indies. And I tell you about our own State Department that had said they're studying because of Morales that the Indians of the Andes were causing trouble. So they were going to have a meeting, and they invited me, and they invited me to be just a listener. And they said, then they asked me to be a speaker, and the leader of the State Department, the guy that was having the program, said, well, we want to discuss the Indian problem. So that we had several very sophisticated people from the universities who had been studying these different tribes in Latin America continued to use that term. The Indian problem was this way. So it came my turn, and I said, one of the things you don't do is they talk about the Indian problem. Fred Harris said to Mayor his Indian problem, and he said, when you say that, you're setting yourself up against them, and you see them as a problem, they'll be a problem. But if you collaborate and cooperate with them, they'll be part of the solution. And it was that simple, but even in this day and time, that's what our government is doing. So I'm going to ask to get a copy of the letter rejecting him, or the information rejecting him, and see what we can do in Washington about why this was done to this university, this wonderful university of diversity that's here. And it's very important that we do something about that. So I'm really looking forward to working with you in the future, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, I'm sorry that I got into that personal life.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harris. Now to introduce our second honored guest, we welcome Dr. Vicki Malo, Assistant Professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and member of the Advisory Council of the Program in Native American and Indigenous Studies. Dr. Vicki Malo.
To introduce Pamela Palmater today. Pamela is a Mi'kmaq lawyer who's joining us today from Toronto, where she's currently an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University, where she also holds the chair in Indigenous governance. Pamela has a doctorate in the science of law and was called to the bar in New Brunswick in 1998. She's a member of the Law Society of New Brunswick, the Canadian Bar Association, and the Indigenous Bar Association. She has been studying, volunteering, and working in Indigenous issues for over 25 years on a wide range of important social, political, and legal issues, including poverty, housing, child and family services, treaty rights, and education, as well as legislation impacting Indigenous peoples. This includes participating as one of the spokespeople, organizers, and educators of the I Will Know More movement in 2012. She's also been recognized with many awards and honors. I'll only name a few here. She has received the Women's Courage Award in Social Justice, Canada's Top Visionary Women Leaders Award, and also the University of New Brunswick's Alumni Award of Distinction. Her public and scholarly work includes her book titled Beyond Blood, Rethinking Indigenous Identity, several legal, academic journal publications, magazine articles, and invited news editorials. Her political blog, Indigenous Nationhood, has been reposted and printed in many formats. She's also a frequent media political commentator, including appearances on Canadian Broadcasting Television and CTV. She has recently, for example, provided really important critical insights on the current status of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the inquiry that's ongoing in Canada, as well as on recent Canadian government gestures towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I also highly recommend her YouTube channel for her really insightful commentary on Indigenous issues. And she's also frequently called as an expert before parliamentary United Nations committees dealing with Indigenous law and policy. I'm so thrilled that she could join us today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela Palmater.
Oh, thank you.
Palmater. What I just did is offer tobacco to my learned elder here for everything that she's done for Indigenous peoples and for my friend from another nation. And I also have tobacco for our friend who couldn't be here. And we'll set his place for him because he should have been here. Palmater. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded territories in Mi'kmaq, which is most of the Atlantic provinces and parts of Maine and Quebec. I'm really honored to be a part of this important discussion on UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and what has it done in the last 10 years. And I think that's important. And I just want to acknowledge that we're having this conversation on Indigenous lands, that we had an opening by the drum group, which is an important part of starting these in a good way. And thank you to everyone who was a part of bringing the both of us here. I think it's really important that we have these conversations, and especially Indigenous women's voices. Because even though there's a move to include more Indigenous content at universities, it's still very male-dominated, and there are lots of learned elders that we can learn from. So I'm honored to be here. It's important to celebrate the success of UNDRIP. So within, a 20-minute time span, you don't have enough to go into the real details of the history, but it's important to celebrate it as a success. And at the same time, however, the passing of UNDRIP was supposed to signify a significant change all over the world. And that hasn't necessarily come to fruition. And that's been part of the problem. And part of the problem is, in fact, lethal. So we're not just dealing with issues of racism and offense and name-calling and all of those things that are hurtful in society. The kind of racism and failure to respect fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples as human beings is lethal. During the decades that UNDRIP was being negotiated, thousands of Indigenous peoples died. Activists died. In the 10 years since it was passed, many more have died. The phenomenon of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls continues in Canada, the United States, Mexico, and South America. These things still continue. The shootings by police, paramilitary, security forces, mining companies of unarmed Indigenous peoples continue. So we have to remember, fundamentally, at the heart of this discussion that we're going to have today is, UNDRIP is a piece of paper. And it's an important piece of paper. But without the actions and protections behind it, of the people who believe in it, it's not going to offer much protection unless we put it into action. And so that's a little bit of what I wanted to talk about today, because it's these heroes and warriors who brought it to fruition, who may have lost their lives in the making, that won't be named. There will be no memorials for them. But they gave their lives for something as significant as making sure that Indigenous peoples are considered human beings, at least these fundamental human rights. And it's in their honor, I think, that we talk about this. Now, here's my warning. I sometimes get a little political. So just forgive me. And no offense to anyone who is of a particular party or not. Here's a quick scan of what's happened in the last 10 years since UNDRIP passed. And UNDRIP, as you know, was passed by the majority of the member states of the United Nations, and 4 particular countries voted against it. Wales, Greece, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. They have all since changed their positions to support what many of them have called an aspirational document. But nonetheless, in this last 10 years, in Canada, we have suffered from a very, very right-wing conservative government. We had former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who literally dedicated a decade of war against Indigenous peoples. I guess I can just say Donald Trump for you guys. People voted for him. It's not like he's just an anomaly. And of course, we've had Mexican President Peña Nieto. And I feel like I could just stop there and everyone would be like, yeah, I got you. You know, there's some problems post-UNDRIP. But the core of these political developments, and not just in leadership, but in society, is this rise of anti-human rights. So we kind of go on this pendulum, and we have stages where you've got the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and the American Indian movement, and this real knowledge building around human rights and Indigenous rights. And now we have this kind of rise of anti-human rights and a blossoming, a re-blossoming of racism. In fact, the merits of racism and sexism are actually back up for debate. As if that's something acceptable in our very learned modern societies. But in fact, it is. Much of the mainstream media is consumed with it. And it's like we've turned back the clock on humanity itself. So we have UNDRIP, this phenomenal document that took so long. Yet somehow, in this 10 years since it's been passed, we've had this retrograde back into racism and sexism. Now, it would be very, very easy for us to all point to Trump and say, Trump is the root of all evil. This is all Trump's fault. Trump brings these values. He has spurred this on in the United States. I mean, he's racist, sexist, classist, elitist, every elite, every is that there is. Okay, so that makes him a very, very easy target. He promises to bring back torture. He's against immigration. He wants Mexicans out. He holds very racist views. But I'm here to tell you, coming from territory that's now referred to as Canada, Canada is no better. We're just a little more polite about it. We have a better PR system. And if you say the word diversity and multiculturalism enough on the international stage, people start to associate you with that. That's the only difference. And this is part of the problem. A decade of former prime ministers' anti-Indigenous rhetorics and critique of human rights at the United Nations. I spent the last 10 years at the United Nations listening to Canadian representatives say, we are not bound by international human rights treaties, or documents, or conventions, or declarations. They're nice to do. We will take your recommendations under advisement, but we are not bound by that. And that was a very different position that Canada, it was a big change. So we thought, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was elected, oh, thank goodness, we'll abandon this. But in the 2 years since he's been elected, when I've been at the United Nations, the government officials have the identical same position. So this is more than just one good or bad leader. There is a fundamental shift happening, and I think we shouldn't get comfortable about UNDRIP being in place, that's, okay, we're good now, let's move on to another issue. In fact, human rights is now as important, Indigenous rights is as important as it ever was. And aside from denying that there's ever any history of colonialism in Canada, I mean, what educated person could possibly imagine that there's no history of colonialism? The kinds of people that run for the Conservative government, not just former Prime Minister Harper, but Kevin O'Leary, on national TV celebrated the fact that there are 3.5 billion people living in poverty in the world, and why did he celebrate that? Quote, that's great news for the wealthy elite, more money for us. This is in Canada. So please don't think you're the only ones to be suffering from this. And Mexico, you know, with all due respect to people who come from Mexico, Human Rights Watch and many, many other organizations have long documented the extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, and a myriad of human rights violations just since UNDRIP was signed. And we had to look this statistic up. Mexico has admitted to not knowing the whereabouts of 27,000 people. That's just in this 10 years since UNDRIP was signed. What did UNDRIP do for these people, or their families, or their communities or nations that they come from? Meanwhile, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was supposed to increase the welfare of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, has in fact declined the welfare of both Mexico and Canada. Indigenous peoples weren't consulted on this, and this is their lands, their territories, their resources. Certainly, this is not where we wanted human rights to head. And we're not the only ones to note this. The United Nations has been sending out core messages and warnings that they have noted that there is a huge anti-human rights backlash that is happening around the world. And that this is a significant concern. And this is something that we need to talk about. Despite all of the laws that may exist, Canada, we have so many laws. We have a constitution and a charter of rights, and we have a national human rights framework and provincial human rights framework. If you want laws, we've got them. But we're not abiding by these human rights laws. So what do we do about this post-UNDRIP? The Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples held a press conference saying specifically that in modern developed countries around the world, protections for Indigenous rights are in retreat. They may not necessarily be noticeable on the books, on the laws, but in practice, there's a mass retreat from the formal kinds of recognitions that was being given, and we have seen that in Canada. If you look at the last decade, Dakota Access Pipeline, how could a county or state even contemplate legislation that would make legal running over protesters? That's almost inviting one to mow down Indigenous protesters or their allies. That's not what UNDRIP envisioned. It's beyond shocking to think that we could overlook the value of human life for politics. And human rights isn't about politics. The former Special Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples, James Anaya, which you may all be familiar with, he specifically noted in one of his last reports on his visit in Canada that in the last decade, coincidentally since UNDRIP was signed, that the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples has deteriorated, has been subjected to such aggressive attacks by the government that the government itself is risking public safety and security in its own actions towards Indigenous peoples. What does that say about a country who's allegedly changed its mind about UNDRIP and embraces it? But Canada has used a different tactic, one that you might be very familiar with. This business around Indigenous rights. The Minister of Indian Affairs, like your Bureau of Indian Affairs here, actually told the entire House, our members of Parliament, that First Nation leaders are quote-unquote threats to national security. What kind of message does that send to the rest of the country where we already have a problem with murders and sexual assaults and child porn and human trafficking by perpetrators who think they can do it with impunity because they can so far? Canada can quote tons of statistics on how many people have been murdered, racially motivated murders, but they have no statistics on who's been arrested and convicted. And what kind of message does that send the community? So these threats to national security changed the dialogue on UNDRIP and human rights from one about human rights or Indigenous rights to one about terrorism. And we should all be very scared. And we need to protect one another. And you know what? We should surrender all of our rights to the government so that they can, in fact, protect us from terrorists. They've used that to co-opt the human rights dialogue and the Indigenous rights dialogue. to stop us, in fact, from making any concrete arguments going forward. Yes, you may have some human rights concerns, but in the interests of homeland security, in the interests of national security, in the interests of protecting people from international terrorists and domestic Indigenous terrorists, name one Indigenous terrorist ever in Canada or the US that has taken a shotgun to a club or to a school and mowed down American citizens and Canadian citizens. But I can name lots of American citizens that are not Indigenous who have done that. And that's said with all due respect. We have a lot to be concerned about. And here's the thing about national security and anti-terrorism dialogue. It's not just in Canada and the US where this is being used. It's being used all over the world now. It is literally the justification they're using to watch people night and day and to control people. And so in the days of racial profiling, when we could object to things like that, now governments are finding ways to justify these kinds of actions. So for Indigenous people, we've now come full circle. Something that we had hoped UNDRIP would stop. So in the very beginning, our lives, our way of being, our identity was criminalized. You know, so in Canada, it was against the law to practice your dances and ceremonies, so they outlawed it in the Indian Act. You weren't allowed to leave the reserve. If you did, you'd be arrested by the RCMP. You weren't allowed to speak and learn your own language. They'd take your kids and put them in residential schools where 40% of them died. If you hunted and fished, they would arrest you and charge you. Even today, people are getting arrested and charged for hunting and fishing. Every aspect of who we are has been criminalized. The only way that we have survived is being criminally Indigenous, existing anyway, despite their laws, because they were anti-human rights laws, they were anti-First Nation laws, they were unjustified laws. So we have a problem where countries give lip service to things like human rights. They will have human rights events. They will have very photogenic, GQ, smilish, selfish prime ministers like Justin Trudeau give compelling speeches to the United Nations. I mean, some of you may have already seen this. I mean, he got a standing ovation for his speech to the United Nations, which he dedicated mostly to Indigenous peoples. We have UNDRIP, we've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we know there's been suffering, we're so sorry for that suffering. And we're going to make a good way forward. But during that whole speech, what he did was he historicized everything. The bad things that happened, that was kind of long ago. That was during treaty negotiations, that was during residential schools, and I'm doing lots to fix it right now. What he didn't tell the world was, in fact, every United Nations report that has come out from any treaty body in the last 10 years since UNDRIP has criticized Canada for grave, crisis, and alarming human rights violations against Indigenous peoples, especially women and girls. That at every single opportunity that Canada has had to make amends, to stop doing what they're doing, they've refused. There's still gender discrimination in the Indian Act after 4 court cases tell them to stop discriminating against Indigenous women. I don't know how many more times the United Nations has to tell them, you're not just violating UNDRIP, you're violating conventions against women and children and all of these other conventions. But they plant seeds of doubt by making us sound like terrorists. That introduction that was given for me, thank you, that was a wonderful introduction. The right-wing media has me as the top 5 to fear, a militant, a radical, a nut bar, and an enemy of the state. And their proof, they even did a whole show on why Pam Palmater is the top 5 to fear. It's because I appear in the media and advocate for Indigenous rights and counter the federal government's false facts or misinformation. That's something we should all do. We should all be critical thinkers, not just for the sake of being critical, but for getting to the facts. Don't trust what I'm saying. Go up and look online. Hey, is this true? Did this Prime Minister say this or that? We should all be challenging what we're being told. Because as it stands right now, the Department of National Defense has an insurgency manual on how to deal with domestic terrorists and insurgents and international ones. And Indigenous peoples are on the list. Because any time we act to defend our lands, our waters, unarmed, without violence, then they have the assumed right to send in the police, the SWAT teams, or the military. And we know what's happened in Canada. Some of you may be familiar with Oka in the 1990s. They literally sent in the army. They've killed our unarmed land defenders. They throw our people in jail. And so here's the reality in Canada for Indigenous peoples in the last decade. Some of our First Nations have the highest suicide rates in the world, and that's taking into account suicide rates in every country, in the poorest countries, post-conflict countries. Some of our First Nations have the highest suicide rates, and one of them, Comanche, has had the highest suicide rate for 25 years standing in a country like Canada. Suicide is actually the #1 cause of death amongst our youth. More than 160 First Nations or reservations are without clean drinking water. Food insecurity has increased, despite the fact that we're only 4% of the population. 50% of all kids in foster care in Canada are Indigenous. 4% of the population, 50% in foster care. But that doesn't even tell you how awful it is. If you zoom in on particular regions, like the province of Manitoba, 90% of all kids in foster care are Indigenous. They literally steal one Indigenous baby a day. So while the Prime Minister is apologizing for having stolen babies in residential schools years ago, we say, why don't you just stop it? How can we get over what's happening if you don't actually stop the colonization, if you don't stop the crimes being committed against us? The poverty rate in First Nations are upwards of 76% of all children in First Nations live in poverty. And some of them literally live next to diamond mines, oil and gas, minerals, and that's another subject. In the last 15 years, the fastest growing prison population are Indigenous women and little girls. And little girls are, in fact, the fastest growing prison population. In the last 10 years since UNDRIP, it has increased 100%. That's in Canada. They're building jails just to house Indigenous peoples. And of course, thousands and thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls who are sexually exploited, who are trafficked, kids who are caught up in child porn rings, led by police officers, doctors, lawyers, social workers, adoption agencies. People don't know this about Canada, but during the 1950s and 60s, they had this massive 60s scoop where they were just literally taking kids out by the busloads. They would advertise them for adoption, and then they would be advertised for sale and resale. Many of them ended up in the United States for sale, where they were resold and resold and resold. We have those same advertisements today in Canada. Today, in 2017, post-UNDRIP, and we haven't even given a word to Aboriginal and treaty rights and land rights. The big ticket items, the things that sustain our nations, that are on the core of our nations. Yes, we have Section 35 in our Constitution. Very important, protects Aboriginal and treaty rights in theory. And the very first court case that came out dealing with it said Aboriginal and treaty rights take priority over everything else. Business, everything else except for conservation, which we agree with. Every court case since now makes us the lowest priority. We are the lowest priority after conservation, after historical settler use, after business needs, after territorial needs, after political needs. We're now the very end. We're at the very end. So basically, Section 35 has now become a legal way to violate our Aboriginal and treaty rights instead of protect it. But our new Liberal Prime Minister promises something different. He promised he would lift the cap on discriminatory programs and services. He promised that he would repeal all of the Prime Minister's oppressive laws, including the anti-terrorism legislation. That was a promise he also made to Canadians. That he would implement all of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, starting with UNDRIP. We will implement it. And to top it off, icing on the cake, yes, 3 prior and informed consent means veto. We have the right to say yes, and we have the right to say no. That was fantastic. Who wouldn't vote for a prime minister like that? In fact, once he got elected, well, you know, we don't really mean veto. We mean working towards yes. And yeah, we're going to keep that cap on funding. And, you know, it's kind of unworkable. We don't know if we can implement it into law. So now they're going back and forth. Well, we could implement it into law unconditionally. Okay, but, you know, actually it has to be conditional based on our Constitution and all of the court cases and the rest of our laws and policies, which already violate our Aboriginal treaty rights. So basically, you can have UNDRIP as long as you don't change the status quo. And that's why we're stuck here 10 years later and nothing has changed. And why we need Canada and Mexico and the United States to get together, Indigenous peoples and allies. We need our allies to force the government to do something different. 10 years after UNDRIP, and we are still debating Indigenous rights and human rights in these three countries. 10 years later, and everything gets much worse. So, what's changed? What has changed? Well, you know what has changed? We have. We're the ones who brought UNDRIP to fruition. We're the ones who coordinated and got together and became allies. We're the ones who protested in the streets. We're the ones who went to the United Nations on our own dime to make sure this happened, and it's happened. And that's the strength of UNDRIP, not the piece of paper. We can make arguments, we can use that, we can have some theoretical rights, but at the end of the day, it's these partnerships that we made. And any success that we've had in protecting our lands or our rights has come from this group of Indigenous people and allies coming together. My really short example, because I know I'm almost out of time, is New Brunswick. Indigenous peoples, the Mi'kmaq Nation, were against hydrofracking in our territory because we didn't want the waters to be damaged. And we weren't just saying it, it wasn't just some spiritual message that was sent to us. This is traditional science, Indigenous science, and it was also modern science that said you really shouldn't be hydrofracking. They like to discount us as, oh, you're just being Indigenous, you're just, talking about epistemology or spirituality. Well, no, we're actually talking about poison water. This actually will kill you. And we rallied and rallied and rallied and rallied, and we had so many allies in New Brunswick that when New Brunswick sent in the RCMP and the SWAT teams and took people down and brought in tanks, that the people in New Brunswick voted that government out and put in a whole new government. Wow! But that's what it's going to take. That's what it's going to take, and it stopped hydrofracking in its tracks for that time. Maybe not forever, but for that time. And what came out of Standing Rock was this amazing coming together of tribes and First Nations and allies and Indigenous peoples from all over the world. We now have connections. We're now working together at the UN on really important things. That's what UNDRIP did. And in return, because of Standing Rock, now we have the Treaty Alliance in Canada. The very same people who are opposing Standing Rock are working together to shut down pipelines, which everyone told us you'll never be able to do it. They couldn't shut it down in Standing Rock. We've shut down 2. And we're going to shut down more. Because at the end of the day, it's our future. So we'll be okay in the end. I know sometimes I give an overly depressing message, but it's a reality check so we don't get comfortable. So that we never say, we've got UNDRIP, okay, we're okay. Let's start and focus on education. We have to do everything all at once. It's an unfair burden, but it's something that we have to do. So now we have to put UNDRIP into action. The next 10 years literally needs to be every Canadian, Mexican, and American citizen in South America coming together and saying, we're going to put it into action. We're going to make it mean something. And we have the power to do it. We've shown where it does work. So we just need to go ahead and do it. And we can make human rights literally the foundation of everything. All of our business, all of our politics, all of our governments, all of our relations. Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we make human relations and human rights and our interactions with the plants and animals and earth the way to do that? And here's something, just a little note. If you don't believe me, and you are of a religious persuasion, the Pope recently said that the only hope that the entire world has of not dying from catastrophic climate change are Indigenous peoples. Because they come from the land, they are the land, and they respect all of their treaty relations where they promise to protect all of the settlers. And we've never stopped doing that despite the horrific things that have happened to us. But if you're not of a religious persuasion, and maybe more scientific, and you like David Suzuki, he said, more than environmentalists, more than conservationists, Indigenous peoples are the ones that will save the planet. Because they're willing to die for the land and water, just the health of the land and water. And so at the end of the day, if you think about it, and you think about the collectivity of Indigenous rights and human rights, Indigenous peoples can be viewed as Indigenous rights as the last best chance that humanity has to not just rally around Indigenous rights, but human rights and a future for everyone. Because we have the shield, we have our rights, we can use these in courts and defend ourselves. But you can't win a battle with only a shield. You need the sword, and our allies are the sword, because you have the numbers, the education, the influence, the money. And if you put that sword and shield together, there isn't anything we won't be able to do to save this planet and one another. UNDRIP or no. But I think UNDRIP's a good way forward.